September 6, 1914, 4:42 a.m. The air along the banks of the Marne River didn't smell like heroism. It smelled like rotting vegetation, wet wool, and the sharp metallic tang of sulfur. At 24 years old, Arthur Penhaligon should have been back in Hereford, meticulously mounting a stag or carving the limbs of a new bow in his workshop. Instead, he was crouched in a shallow, waterlogged trench, his boots sinking 6 inches into the gray, sucking mud of northern France. Arthur, or Artie to the men who didn't laugh at him, wasn't holding a short-magazine Lee Enfield rifle. He wasn't even carrying a sidearm. Clutched in his calloused hands was a 6-foot-3-inch stave of seasoned Italian yew, backed with rawhide and tipped with polished horn. It was a weapon that belonged in 1414, not 1914. To the British High Command it was a joke. To the German snipers hidden in the reeds 300 yards away, it was invisible. But within the next 48 hours, this museum piece would become the most efficient killing machine on the Western Front, silent enough to bypass the ears of elite marksmen and deadly enough to punch through the steel helmets of the Kaiser's finest. Arthur was a man of quiet paradoxes. Back home, he was a taxidermist, a master of preserving life's outward form after the soul had departed. He had spent a decade in the dense Hereford woods, where visibility was often less than 20 yards. He didn't hunt by sight alone. He hunted by kinetic estimation. He felt the weight of the air, the snap of a twig, and the subtle shift in a bird's flight. When the war broke out, he tried to do his duty. He stood in line at the recruitment office, but the British Army had no category for a man who looked at the world with both eyes wide open. During the standard eye test, the regimental quartermaster had watched Artie intently. Artie didn't squint. He didn't close his left eye to focus his right. He stared straight ahead, processing the entire field of vision at once. The quartermaster, a man whose imagination was as stiff as his starched collar, flagged Artie as unconventional and denied him a standard-issue rifle. "If you can't close an eye to aim, you can't hit a Hun," the man had barked. "We've no room for circus performers in the infantry." Artie was sent to the front lines with the 2nd Battalion, not as a marksman, but as a general laborer. He was told to stay out of the way, to dig latrines, and to carry crates of ammunition for weapons he wasn't allowed to fire. But Artie didn't come empty-handed. He had brought his toy. He had spent months secretly seasoning a 110-pound draw-weight longbow, hand-forging his own bodkin arrowheads, heavy, square-sectioned steel points designed specifically to pierce armor. When Major General Horace Smith Dorey and staff officers first saw Artie practicing in a field behind the lines, the laughter was deafening. One captain, leaning on a cane, pointed at the wooden stave and asked, "Does the boy think we're fighting the French at Agincourt? Give him a shovel. He'll be more useful digging his own grave than trying to poke the Kaiser with a knitting needle." They called him Robin Hood, with a sneer, never realizing that the weapon they were mocking had once ended the age of chivalry. By the first week of September, the laughter had died in the throats of the men of the 2nd Battalion. The retreat from Mons had turned into a desperate stand at the Marne. The British were backed against the river, and the Petit Morin Bridge was the only thing standing between 4,000 retreating soldiers and a German pincer movement that would grind them into the dirt. The German Black Eagle Unit, a specialized group of 9 elite snipers, had taken up positions in the marshy, reed-choked banks. They were ghosts in field gray. Every time a British soldier tried to move toward the bridge, a Mauser 98 would bark, and another man would drop. The problem wasn't just the snipers, it was the environment. The Marne was a cauldron of sulphurous morning fog and thick, oily mud. The British Lee Enfield rifles, though legendary, were failing. The fine tolerances of the bolt actions were being choked by the grit. A single grain of sand in the wrong place rendered a modern rifle into a useless club. Worse, every time a British soldier did manage to fire, the massive muzzle flash and the roar of the .303 caliber round acted like a beacon in the fog, telling the Germans exactly where to aim their next shot. Amidst this chaos, Artie found his only friend, Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Miller. Tommy was 31, a career soldier from the industrial heart of Leeds, who had seen enough blood to know that arrogance was a luxury the infantry couldn't afford. While the officers mocked Artie, Tommy had shared his tobacco and listened to Artie talk about the tension of wood and the flight of an arrow. Tommy had a daughter back home who was about to turn 5. and he carried a small, hand-carved wooden doll in his breast pocket to remind him of her. On the morning of September 6th, the fog was so thick you could taste the dampness on your tongue. The battalion was pinned down, the mud holding them in place like flies in amber. Tommy noticed a jam in his rifle. A clump of Marne silt had wedged into the receiver. As he leaned up slightly to clear the bolt with a pocket knife, the silence of the marsh was shattered. A single, sharp crack rang out from 300 yards away. The bullet didn't miss. It struck Tommy through the throat, severing the carotid artery and slamming him back into the mud. Artie reached for him, his hands instantly slick with the hot, iron-scented blood of his friend. He watched as Tommy's eyes lost focus, the life draining out of him in rhythmic pulses that matched the frantic beating of Artie's own heart. The wooden doll Tommy had carried fell from his pocket, landing face down in the muck. It was a death caused by the very technology that was supposed to protect them, the loud, smoky, temperamental machinery of modern war. The German sniper didn't even have to move. He just waited for the sound of a bolt clicking or the flash of a polished barrel. Artie felt a coldness settle over him that had nothing to do with the morning mist. It was a clarity he had only felt in the deepest woods of Hereford. He looked at the men around him, terrified, huddled, their rifles jammed or their positions compromised. He looked at the bridge, which was now being zeroed in by German artillery spotters. If those 9 snipers weren't cleared, the bridge wouldn't be crossed, and 4,000 men would be slaughtered before sunset. Artie reached for his longbow, which he had kept wrapped in a waterproof oilskin. He unwrapped it slowly, the yew-wood gleaming with a dull, organic luster. He stepped over the body of his friend, ignoring the shouts of a nearby corporal who told him to get back down. Artie didn't need a bolt action. He didn't need a muzzle flash. He stepped into the reeds, moving with the silent, rhythmic grace of a predator. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a taxidermist looking for his next specimen. He knew that in this fog, sound traveled differently, and light was a lie. He would have to hunt these 9 elite marksmen using the same ancient instincts that had guided his ancestors. The Germans were expecting rifles. They were expecting noise. They were expecting the predictable rhythm of a 20th century firefight. They weren't prepared for a shadow in the mist that could launch a 14-inch steel spike at 200 feet per second with no more sound than the snap of a dry twig. As Artie disappeared into the sulphurous haze, his fingers found the string, a cord of braided hemp and silk. He felt the 110-pound resistance, a weight that would have snapped the shoulders of a lesser man, but to him it was the familiar tension of a living thing. He drew the first bodkin arrow from his quiver. The head was cold to the touch, black and unforgiving. He wasn't just going to kill these snipers, he was going to erase them from the map. The Black Eagle unit was about to learn that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't the one that makes the most noise, it's the one you never hear coming. Arthur Penhaligon, the museum piece, the boy they wanted to give a shovel, was now the only thing standing between the British Army and total annihilation. The hunt had begun. He moved through the chest-high reeds, the water of the Marne chilling his legs, but his core was burning. He counted the heartbeats between the distant German rifle shots. He was ranging them. He was feeling the vibration of their Mausers through the very soles of his feet. The first sniper was less than 80 yards away, hidden in the hollow of a lightning-struck willow tree. Artie raised the bow, his muscles coiling like a spring, his eyes wide open, seeing everything and nothing all at once. The string touched his cheek. The world went silent. He released. The willow tree was a skeletal silhouette against the shifting gray curtain of the Marne. Artie stood chest-deep in the stagnant water, the cold biting through his wool trousers like 1,000 needles. The marsh water smelled of ancient rot and the acidic sting of discarded shell casings. To his left, the bridge groaned under the weight of the morning's artillery vibration, a low-frequency hum that Artie felt in his teeth. He watched the willow tree. He didn't look for a man. He looked for the absence of fog. There, nestled in a fork 65 yards away, was a darker patch of gray. A German sniper. Artie reached back and selected a 30-inch cedar shaft. It was fletched with goose feathers, angled slightly to provide a gyroscopic spin that would stabilize the heavy bodkin head. He nocked the arrow, the click of the horn-reinforced notch against the hemp string barely louder than a heartbeat. This was the moment where the 110-pound draw weight became a physical burden. As he began the draw, his rhomboid muscles screamed, the tension equivalent to lifting a heavy trunk with one hand. The U-stave groaned, a deep organic sound of wood fibers compressing. At 11:14 a.m., the fog thinned for a fraction of a second. Artie saw the glint of a Zeiss scope. He didn't wait. He released. The string slapped his leather bracer with a sharp thwack. The arrow didn't whistle, it hissed. Traveling at 195 feet per second, the steel bodkin point covered the distance in less than a second. It struck the German sniper just below the rim of his Stahlhelm. The heavy square point didn't just penetrate, it shattered the temporal bone and pinned the man's head to the trunk of the willow. There was no scream. There was only the muffled sound of a body slumping forward, caught by the very tree that had hidden him. Kill 1 of 9. But the victory was short-lived. To Artie's right, the British line was breaking under the psychological weight of the unseen marksman. Private Henry Hank Wallace, only 19 years old from Bristol, couldn't take the silence anymore. Hank had been a baker's apprentice before the war, a boy who talked incessantly about the smell of fresh sourdough in his mother's flower garden. He had survived the retreat from Mons, but the stillness of the Marne was breaking him. Hank reached out from behind a mud-slicked embankment to grab a discarded water canteen. "Get down, Hank," a voice hissed, but it was too late. The second German sniper, positioned higher up the ridge in a pile of rubble, fired. The 7.92 Mauser round traveled at 2,500 feet per second. It struck Hank in the center of his forehead, the exit wound spraying a mist of crimson across the gray mud. Hank Wallace died at 11:22 a.m., his hand still inches away from the canteen. Artie watched as the light left the boy's eyes, replaced by the dull glaze of the Marne fog. The situation was worsening by the minute. The German artillery was beginning to range the Petit Morin bridge with terrifying accuracy. If the snipers weren't cleared, the British engineers wouldn't be able to reinforce the structure for the 4,000 men approaching from the north. The mud was becoming a lethal obstacle. It was now so thick that the British soldiers were having to use their bayonets to scrape the sludge out of their rifle chambers every 3 minutes. The rifles were failing, the men were dying, and the fog was acting as a shield for the Black Eagle unit. If you want to see how Artie's medieval equipment fared against a modern German unit trained for elite marksman warfare, please hit the like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And subscribe if you haven't already. Artie felt the weight of the injustice like a physical blow. The officers back at headquarters were likely sipping tea, discussing the obsolescence of manual labor while men like Hank Wallace were being erased by technology they couldn't even see. Artie's internal monologue was a storm of Hereford woods and bloody marshes. He thought about the yew tree, the wood he held in his hand. In England, yew trees were traditionally planted in churchyards. They were the trees of the dead, their roots supposedly reaching down to touch the mouths of the buried. Artie felt like an extension of that root system. He wasn't a soldier, he was a reaper. He moved deeper into the marsh, the water now reaching his waist. He felt a sharp pressure against his thigh, a submerged piece of barbed wire. It tore through his trousers and sliced 3 inches into his skin. Artie didn't flinch. He felt the warm flow of his own blood mixing with the cold river water, but he kept his eyes locked on the ridge. He needed to find the second sniper, the one who had killed Hank. He spotted a puff of cordite smoke. It was faint, a ghostly smudge against the limestone ruins of a farmhouse 140 yards away. That was nearly double the distance of his first shot. At 140 yards, an arrow's trajectory is a steep arc. Artie would have to aim nearly 10 feet above the target to compensate for gravity. He also had to account for the crosswind blowing off the river at an estimated 8 miles per hour. Artie selected his straightest arrow. He felt the goose feathers, ensuring they weren't matted by the mist. He used a small tin of beeswax from his pocket to coat the string, a vital technical detail. If the hemp got too damp, it would stretch, and the bow would lose its cast, or its ability to propel the arrow with lethal force. He drew the bow. This time, he held the draw for 5 long seconds, his entire body shaking with the 110-pound strain. He was a human catapult. He visualized the arc, the way the cedar shaft would climb into the fog and then drop like a hawk. He released. The arrow soared. For a moment, it disappeared into the upper layers of the mist. Then it plummeted. Corporal William "Bill" Sykes, a 26-year-old dock worker from London, was crouched 10 yards from Artie. Bill was a giant of a man, with hands the size of dinner plates. He had once shared a tin of peaches with Artie when the rations ran low. Bill watched the sky, his mouth open in disbelief. He saw the arrow descend. The German sniper in the farmhouse ruins never saw it. He was busy reloading his Mauser, his eyes pressed against the scope. The bodkin head crashed through the slate roof tiles, losing only a fraction of its velocity, and buried itself in the sniper's upper chest, severing the subclavian artery. The German fell backward, his rifle clattering down the stone stairs. Kill 2 of 9. "Did you see that?" Bill whispered, his voice trembling. "Artie, you bloody legend, you got him with a stick." But Artie didn't celebrate. He felt the vibration of the ground. The Germans were changing tactics. They had realized that the silence of the British line wasn't just due to fear. Someone was hunting them back. They began area fire. Instead of precision shots, the remaining 7 snipers began firing rapidly into the reeds, hoping to hit the ghost by sheer volume of lead. Bullets zipped through the air with a sound like tearing silk. One round passed so close to Artie's head, less than 2 inches, that the vacuum of its passage popped his left eardrum. He felt a sudden sharp pain, followed by a warm trickle of fluid and a deafening ringing. His balance wavered, the world tilted. He sank into the mud, the bow held high above his head to keep the wood dry. He lay there, submerged in the filth, listening to the rhythmic crack boom of the Mausers. He counted them. He was mapping their positions by the sound of their reports. 1, 2, 5, 6. He was missing 1. There were 9 snipers in the Black Eagle unit. He had killed 2. 6 were firing. Where was the 9th? The answer came in the form of a massive explosion. A German spotter, hidden even better than the snipers, had signaled an artillery battery. A 70-millimeter shell landed 40 yards from Artie's position, throwing a geyser of black mud and shrapnel into the air. Artie crawled toward the crater, his lungs burning from the sulfurous fumes. Inside the smoking hole, he found something that changed everything. A dead German spotter had been tossed into the open by the blast. Clutched in the man's hand was a waterproof leather map case. Artie pulled it open. His heart stopped. The map didn't just show the British positions. It showed 5 specific X marks on the Petit Morin Bridge, the exact structural points where demolition charges had already been planted by a German sabotage team during the night. The 9th sniper wasn't hunting soldiers. He was guarding the detonator. Artie looked at the bridge. In the shifting light, he saw him. A German officer, Major Kurt von Stiglitz, was crouched under the western pylon, a plunger-style detonator in his lap. He was waiting for the British column to reach the center of the span. Artie was 190 yards away. The mud was pulling at his legs, his ear was bleeding, and his best friend's blood was still drying on his hands. He had 7 snipers between him and the pylon, and less than 10 minutes before the British 2nd Battalion marched onto a death trap. He looked at his quiver. He had 12 arrows left. The turning point had arrived. This wasn't just a duel anymore. It was a race against the clock to save 4,000 lives with a weapon that the world had forgotten. Artie wiped the mud from his eyes, felt the weight of the U-stave, and began to move through the reeds, not as a man, but as a shadow of the 15th century, brought to life to finish a job the 20th century couldn't handle. He espremu. He squeezed, the grip of his bow, his knuckles white. He was ready to kill the rest. At 1:05 p.m., the fog over the Marne began to swirl, caught in a sudden cold downdraft that smelled of wet earth and spent cordite. Artie was now 110 yards from the bridge, his left ear still ringing with a dull, sickening hum from the previous explosion. His vision was tunneling, focusing only on the micro-movements of the reeds. He saw a mossy limestone block near a cluster of alder trees. A shadow moved. It was the 3rd sniper of the Black Eagle unit. Artie didn't hesitate. He felt the 110-pound tension of the U-stave, the wood fibers groaning at the limit of their elasticity. He compensated for the 12-mile-per-hour crosswind, aiming 4 feet to the left of the target. He released. The hissed flight of the cedar shaft was lost in the roar of a distant shell. The 850 grain arrow struck the sniper in the center of the chest, the bodkin point shattering the man's sternum and exiting through his spine. Kill 3 of 9. Artie moved forward, his knees clicking with every step in the thick, viscous mud. He was becoming a ghost in the marsh. At 1:20 p.m., 2 Mauser shots rang out in rapid succession, the bullets snapping through the reeds inches from his ribs. Near-death number 2. A round clipped the upper limb of his bow, shaving off a splinter of yew, but missing the rawhide backing by less than half an inch. If the string had been cut, Artie would have been defenseless. He dropped into a shallow pool of stagnant water, the taste of iron and sulfur filling his mouth. He saw them. 2 snipers, kills 4 and 5, positioned in a pincer move 45 yards away. They were reloading, their bolt handles clicking in the silence between artillery rounds. Artie drew 2 arrows from his quiver, holding one in his teeth. He rose from the water like a swamp demon. He fired the first, then the second, in a span of 6 seconds. The first German was perforated through the lung, the second took a steel point through the throat. Both men collapsed into the mud without a sound. The physical toll was mounting. Artie's fingers were bleeding where the hemp string had worn through his leather tab. His right shoulder felt as if it were being seared by a hot iron. It was then that he saw a familiar face crawling toward him. It was Private Silas Vance, 22 years old, a fellow Hereford boy who had spent his youth bird-watching in the same woods where Artie hunted. Silas was dragging a heavy crate of water and a few jammed rifles, hoping to reach the forward line. "Artie, you're still alive," Silas whispered, a look of desperate hope in his eyes. But as Silas reached out to hand Artie a canteen, the 6th German sniper, hidden in a burnt-out wagon on the ridge, fired. The bullet struck Silas in the center of his chest, the impact throwing him backward. Silas died at 1:42 p.m., his last breath a rattling sigh as he tried to say the name of the girl he was supposed to marry in October. Artie felt a cold, jagged rage replace the exhaustion. Silas was the 3rd friend he had lost to the Black Eagle unit. Artie didn't stay in the water. He climbed onto the ridge, exposing himself. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to feel the primitive terror of an enemy they couldn't hear. The 6th sniper in the wagon saw Artie and panicked, firing 3 shots in a frantic blur. Near-death number 3. A bullet grazed Artie's left forearm, carving a 4-inch furrow through his muscle. He didn't even flinch. He drew the bow to full power, his muscles bulging until the veins in his neck threatened to burst. At 90 yards, he launched a heavy sheaf arrow. It struck the wooden side of the wagon, punched through the oak planking, and found the sniper's heart. Kill 6 of 9. Only 3 remained, plus the officer at the bridge. The 7th and 8th snipers were veterans. They stopped firing, realizing their muzzle flashes were their death warrants. They began to stalk Artie through the dense brush. At 1:55 p.m., the 7th sniper lunged from a thicket with a fixed bayonet. Near-death number 4. The steel blade passed through Artie's tunic, missing his spleen by 2 inches. Artie didn't have time to draw his bow. He used the 6-foot stave as a staff, parrying the thrust and driving the horn-tipped end of the bow into the German's temple. As the man staggered, Artie pulled a bodkin arrow from his quiver and used it like a dagger, plunging the steel head into the sniper's neck. Kill 7 of 9. The 8th sniper, seeing his comrade fall, turned to flee toward the bridge. Artie knelt in the mud, calmed his breathing, and sent a cedar shaft through the man's lower back at 120 yards. Kill 8 of 9. The final target was Major Kurt von Stieglitz. He was 190 yards away, crouched under the western pylon of the Petit Morin Bridge. The British 2nd Battalion was now only 300 yards from the northern entrance of the span. Von Stieglitz had his hand on the detonator plunger. He was smiling, his eyes fixed on the approaching column of 4,000 men. Artie had 1 arrow left. The wind was gusting, and the fog was thickening again, saturated with the smell of a nearby burning fuel depot. Artie stood on the muddy embankment, the silhouette of a medieval archer against a sky of 20th century fire. He knew he couldn't hit the major directly through the steel girders of the pylon. He had to make a technical trick shot, a high-angle lob that would drop the arrow vertically behind the pylon's protection. He drew the string back, his fingers screaming, his vision blurred by blood and sweat. He aimed nearly 30 feet above the pylon. He felt the vibration of the ground. A German 77mm shell landed 50 yards behind him. Near-death number 5. The shrapnel peppered his back, small hot shards of steel embedding in his shoulder, but he held the draw. He released at 1:59 p.m. The arrow climbed. It was a silent black streak against the gray clouds. Von Stieglitz began to push the plunger down. The arrow descended with the velocity of a falling stone. It didn't hit the major, it hit the detonator itself. The heavy steel bodkin head smashed through the wooden casing of the device, severing the internal wires and pinning the plunger halfway down. Von Stieglitz stared at the vibrating cedar shaft in shock. Before he could reach for his Luger, a second arrow, one Artie had scavenged from Silas's belt, arrived. It struck the major in the throat, pinning him to the wooden pylon. Kill 9 of 9. The bridge was safe. At 2:15 p.m., the lead elements of the 2nd Battalion began to pour across the Petit Morin. They saw the German snipers all dead from unexplained puncture wounds. They saw the major pinned to the bridge pylon by a wooden stick. But they didn't see Artie. He had crawled back into the marsh, his bow broken in two from the final shrapnel hit, his body a map of scars and burns. The aftermath was a masterclass in bureaucratic silence. When Major General Smith-Dorrien's staff toured the site, they were horrified. They couldn't admit that their modern rifles had failed and that a museum piece had saved the army. The official report stated the bridge was cleared by concentrated artillery fire and flanking maneuvers. Artie was given a standard-issue Lee Enfield and told never to speak of his bow again. He was denied a Victoria Cross because there were no official witnesses to his kills. The only men who saw him were dead, and the officers refused to believe his story. Arthur Penhaligon returned to Hereford after the war in 1919. He went back to his taxidermy shop, a quiet man who walked with a limp and never liked the sound of thunder. He married a local girl and had 3 children. In his workshop, hidden behind a false wall, he kept the 2 pieces of his shattered U-bow and a single blood-stained bodkin arrow. He died in 1962, a commoner with a secret that could have rewritten history books. If this story touched you the way it touched us, please do us a favor. Hit the like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about the kind of soldiers who proved their worth with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the UK, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You aren't just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Arthur Penhaligon doesn't disappear into the silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping to make that happen. The silence of the Marne may have covered his tracks, but today, his story is finally told. Duração estimada, 30 minutos. Contagem de palavras, 4.420 palavras. Total. Números específicos usados, 72 vítimas nomeadas. 3. Tommy Miller, Hank Wallace, Silas Vance. Quase mortes, 5.